Hello everybody and welcome to the show where today I'm talking to Dylan Stevens, who we did a podcast before, so this is our second time together. And today we're going to talk about your website, Pesher of Christ. So thank you, Dylan, for joining us, and maybe we could start with you explaining what Pesher is, for those that don't know what the word Pesher means.
Yes, it's wonderful to be here. Pesher is a word that was used in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and by that word they would quote a passage from the Old Testament, and then they would say the Pesher is, and then they would talk about some present day thing and describe as if that passage that they just used was predicting their future, which is an amazing thing for them to be doing. And it was quite unique it was only some of the part of the Dead Sea Scrolls that had this in it. And they're basically the ones that, if you try to go to Jerusalem and see, there's the Temple of the Scroll, and I don't think they're even in there because they thought these were just garbage, because actually where they were treated as garbage because they were in a cave where they were all bits and pieces in this cave. It's almost as if they were the garbage, but because they mentioned the word God in them, they couldn't destroy them because that would be destroying God. So this cave was probably their garbage bin. And we're reading their garbage that they threw away. But it's so enlightening to see that, though, because that they would believe that that was true. And that these passages previous were predictions. They found solace in the fact that they were going through what was predicted, you know. So that word is a great word to use for Jesus's life, because his life he wasn't a god, he was a man, and as Barbara Thiering first pointed out in her book Jesus the Man, he actually never once said that he was God. He only said he was the Son of Man. It's other people that called him the Son of God, and that's an annoying thing, actually, because he was a wonderful, inspiring person, but for us to think that he's going to be up there in heaven doing all this stuff for us, I think is a terrible mistake, because it's within us that we have to do the work. And that's the way Jesus taught it too. So the word Pesher, I did this site for Dr. Barbara Thiering for quite a few years. I built the whole site, and her site is up there, and I promised I would leave it up there for her. But I also started building my own site because she had some very complicated rules of Pesher that would look at the sentences and do different subjects for the sentences based on different criteria. And she felt that she found a lot of meaning in that. But I found that if you look at the stories themselves, you can see that every story there is an allegorical story. Even even being on the cross and dying was allegorical also. It just but that's similar to the concept of Pesher, that, you know, that words put down ages before are now coming true. Well, it's the same kind of principle, that you're not telling the whole story. You're trying to let people find the story within the text. But silly us decided that all these miracles were miracles. So you kind of go around wanting to raise people from the dead, walk on water, and all these things that you can't do, that the physical world prevents you from doing. And that's not helpful. So people say, you know, why are you spending so much time proving that these aren't miracles? Who wants to know that, you know?
So these are all analogies, like the turning the water to wine is an analogy for, you was explaining earlier about the Gentiles.
Exactly, and that's a key one. There you go. That you've got turning water into wine. It's actually a wedding feast, and right there is his marriage to Mary Magdalene, which a lot of the people in the church don't believe it is true. She's been turned into a prostitute, a reformed prostitute, which is totally ridiculous. But actually, see, there was even some, I've gone off on a tangent, which I said this is dangerous. But it's that one is interesting, the stoning of the prostitute. That was his mother. His mother, Helena, is talked about in the Clementine books that were written by Pope Clement, the first pope, really the first pope of the Christian church. He wrote the Clementine. Recollections and homilies, they're slightly different. But in there, it shows that her mother was Helena and that she was a temple priestess, which is sort of a euphemism for prostitute in those days. And so it was her that they were stoning. It wasn't Mary Magdalene. So all of these stories have answers to them, but you have to look for them. And so anyway, getting back to Mary Magdalene, that marriage, turning water into wine, the baptism was done by water when you would join the inner circle of the church. But for the Gentiles, they weren't allowed in the inner circle of the church, and they had baptism by water, by salt water, that is. And that's the story of walking on water, because that was the baptism of the Gentiles, that Peter would be there with Peter and Andrew would be there pouring salt water on the Gentiles, giving them a baptism so they could be semi-part of the church. They weren't allowed into the inner circle, but they were still on the outskirts and they could listen to different sermons and things. So that was the water part of it. And then when you were in the inner circle, you would be allowed to have wine at the ceremony, like the Last Supper. They would pass the wine and the bread around in that ceremony. And so Jesus, in just this one miracle, he changed water into wine. In other words, he said the Gentiles could now be baptized by water, and they could now have a chance to have wine in the inner circle. And this is really why Christianity was so popular, because now the Gentiles had a chance of being in the inner circle. Otherwise, you had to be Jewish to be in the inner circle.
And we were talking about how this was to do with the Essenes, because it was from the Essenes that the Dead Sea, well, we think the Dead Sea Scrolls are from the Essenes. So this is the Essene, well, it's not a cult, is it? But it was a breakaway group of Jewish worshippers.
Right. And they were actually really popular, and yet there isn't that much text on them. But there certainly is evidence to show that Qumran is located on the Dead Sea, and that's where they found all the scrolls. So there was definitely a community there. And it's actually coded in the New Testament, where anytime you see the word Jerusalem in plural, it means Qumran. And when it's in the singular, it means Jerusalem.
Oh, it's in the Holy City.
So most of the time, Jesus spent around Qumran, when he was going to Jerusalem. And then lower down on the Dead Sea, there are these other spots. There's Ein Feshka and there's Mazin. And Ein Feshka was really that's where the Gentiles would live. And then Qumran would be where the important people would be. And below that was Mazin, and Mazin was the place where they did the baptism of the Gentiles. And they were all on the Dead Sea there. So Jesus spent all this time walking back and forth from these towns, and very few times did they actually go to Jerusalem proper. And the reason for that is the Essenes were thrown out of Jerusalem. I mean, there actually is an Essene gate, but they were basically rejected from Jerusalem. And they said, we're going to go out on our own, and we're going to form a new Jerusalem. And so Jesus was operating within the new Jerusalem. Plus, the secret there is the new Jerusalem in Revelations, because there you go. There's the new Jerusalem, which was Qumran, but then it was turned into the whole world as the New Jerusalem. And then, so going back to that, being reminded of Revelations. I wanted to talk about the Four Horsemen,
Yes, let's talk about
which
them.
are not the horrible people that we think of, killing everybody. They are the 4 books of the New Testament. And they were so excited about these books being published. Unsealed was the publishing of these books to the world. And the horseback was the priests on the horseback bringing the new texts to the people. And they did it in a lot of things that sounded like a lot of bad things, like death was an example. And yet that was death. The death you have of going into the monastery, entering into the church, was a death. It was a death to the world outside. And so it's a death that is important. You need to die to be born again into the Spirit. So it wasn't a person going around and killing everybody. So I think that's so important today to realize that people are just looking for an apocalypse, and it's not that at all. The apocalypse is actually a history of the church from actually the very beginning of Herod's temple all the way up to 100 AD. And it was written by a few people. There's a John in the beginning and a John at the end. That would be the son of John. And the John who wrote it was the John who was the disciple John. And then there was a disciple James who wrote a section of it. And actually they put it in the wrong order because James's one is first. It should have really started with the birth.
And this is the book of Revelation we're talking about?
Yes, the book of Revelation, right, yeah. So it needs to be read as a history, and of course all of the different people in it are metaphoric people that you have to decipher. The big one is the good old 666 guy. He was actually the top guy he was actually Jesus's superior, and his name was Simon Magus. And he was reviled in the end because they had slight differences. It was sort of like Jesus was more of a neutral character, and he was more
perhaps in
a different direction, really.
Right.
So that if you read the story of Peter in Rome, Peter was in Rome, and Simon Magus was in Rome, and Simon Magus, he was an expert at bringing people to hear him talk, because he would do these different acrobatic acts. One of the things was to walk on a rope across, and he did this in Rome, and there were thousands, well, I don't know thousands, but for that time a lot of people were watching this acrobatic thing. And so Peter came along, and he messed with it and made him fall, and he fell to the ground and he died, because they were both, Peter and Simon were enemies at that point, really, trying to have more followers than the other. So Peter got blamed for making him die. So he was 666 was Simon Magus. Simon Magus, by the way, was the priest that brought the book of John to the world. Because the book of John really is the book that was written by Jesus about himself. You can see it's totally different from the others.
So this is the Gospel of John, is it?
The what?
What's known as the Gospel to most people. The Gospel.
Yeah, the Gospels. Gospel of John.
Because it is more mystical.
Gospel of John was brought by the writer that the fourth horse was the one that Simon Magus rode, and that was the book of John. And as I said, that's the book that I think everybody loves the most. It has the most poetic things, and it has a whole different flavor to it. But that's to say that Simon Magus was his superior. and that's another one of those miracles that's really important too. The one where he went up to the mountain and he spoke to Elijah, and he spoke to
Moses, wasn't it?
Moses. Yes, Moses and Elijah. Right. So Moses and Elijah were key people who were representing those figures, and they did this in their ceremonies. They would be representatives of those figures, so that it's like the high priest was the representative of God to the world, and so you had other representatives who were Moses and Elijah, the important ones, and they
So
were up
like
there.
roles, the names of
Yeah,
roles.
yeah, and in there, sort of like, right. So that was the time that Jesus decided he was going to come out dressed in a white robe, which meant that he was representing God, which is what the priest would have been wearing, because the priest just didn't have to be there at that time. And he came out with this white robe, and the people went crazy because that was him declaring himself God, and they were just, hurling stuff at him and everything. And Simon Magus had to come into that and break it up and say, "This is my son." You'll see the words there. He said, "No, he's my son. That's all right. He's not. I'm over him. I'll take care of it." But see, that's mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a whole section where Jesus is called the wicked priest, and also in other texts, the teacher of righteousness is John the Baptist. But there's a section where it says that the wicked priest told a bunch of lies and caused trouble, huge trouble in the congregation. It reads something like that. And that's the interesting correlation to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the different events in the Bible. And that one is very intriguing. Because again, the implication of that miracle is that Jesus was able to speak to Elijah and Moses because he's just so fantastically spiritual. And yet it was all metaphoric. And it was also the time that Jesus got himself in trouble, because you'll notice after that, Caiaphas started going after Jesus also. He already had Simon Magus on his list to crucify, but Caiaphas at that point said, "I'm going to get rid of this Jesus guy." And that's how Jesus ended up on the cross, because of that.
And Caiaphas was the high priest, wasn't he, of the time?
Yes.
In Jerusalem, the holy city.
Right. So, let's see. Jumping around a bit.
Can I just ask, if Simon Magus was originally Jesus's teacher?
Yes.
Would he also have been John the Baptist's teacher?
No.
Right. Okay.
No, that was a different faction. They were the more orthodox ones that would not have let in the Gentiles into the organization. He went around baptizing people, but that wasn't to let them into the church. It was just to let them be outside the church. That was the concept of the salt water. Baptize them in salt water, and they can be part of the church. And so that's what John the Baptist was teaching. And actually, John the Baptist had been destined to be the leader from very young. But once he was killed, you'll notice that Jesus then became the next person in line.
Someone had to take that role on after the Baptist.
Yeah, there was a big vacuum there, and that was, it boosted Jesus's popularity. And I guess there was one thing. Going back to, because also John the Baptist had come from the right family. He had the right lineage, everything. But Jesus had a problem with his lineage. He was from the line of David. But Joseph and Mary were only betrothed at the point that Jesus was born. And this made him illegitimate and unable to be have a priestly role, because he was illegitimate. But then different high priests would say it was okay because they were already engaged, and will accept it. And you'll see that's the text going through there at the beginning in the birth. So he had to this was a tough thing for Jesus to overcome in his teachings, because they were always saying, we're not going to listen to you, you're illegitimate. But the beauty of that, of course, was that it made him try harder. And the other thing is that he got to have people around him who were very important and free-thinking people. And I can go through his disciples, which is very intriguing. I did that on another site. I have a web, there's a YouTube site that's called Pesher of Christ also. And I do a little thing about what the Pesher means, and also go through the Last Supper and tell you each person who they are. And I think that would be fun to do.
Yeah, let's do that.
So Peter is interesting. Now you'll notice, and a lot of people don't realize this, but Peter was married. So why is it that the church people have to be celibate? Because there you have the top guy and he's married. And it's quite intriguing. That was one of the first healings, was Jesus's wife's mother was healed. And if you start tracing that thing, you'll find out that his wife was one of the descendants from Herod. Herod had a huge family. He had something like 8 wives or something, tons of different children around there vying for top roles. And so Peter had married into that. So he had quite a big importance. So you'll notice later on, after Jesus had supposedly died, there was an actual fight with Peter and Agrippa, who was from the Herod family, who had now become king. He glommed together back all of the things that had been lost. And he almost had a kingdom as big as his grandfather Herod. But Peter tells him off, and it's like, okay, you're going to tell this guy off and expect to live? But he lived because, of course, he was related to Herod, which is a good thing to have, right? Of course, that didn't matter at all when it came down to Nero. Nero, when Nero killed Peter and Paul. He was Roman, so being a Herod wasn't helpful. It was slightly helpful, but not all that helpful to prevent his execution. So, okay, we did Peter. Andrew is a tough one. He's always shown with Peter. And you can't really, it's not clear who he was, really. But then you have James and John, and that's a very intriguing one, because they're mentioned in the Clementine books, which are written by Pope Clement, who really was the first pope. They have 2 others before him, but he was the real pope. And he wrote the Clementines, and there's Clementine recollections and Clementine homilies, because they're slightly different. They came sort of from different, they were remembered in different ways, or whatever you could say. But they, in that, there were the 2 illegitimate sons from Caesar. And Caesar Augustus had a daughter, Julia, and he made her marry Tiberius in order to get Tiberius to be after him when he died. And she absolutely hated him. And she had an affair with the son of Mark Antony. And they had 2 twins. And the mother rushed off with these twins before she rushed off with the twins, and they got lost at sea. They got separated, and the mother ended up on an island, and the twins ended up in the slave market. And they were brought up by, what's her name now?
Don't know.
Oh, well, yeah, they were brought up. Yeah, they were brought up by Helena. That's the name. She has a different name there, but she is Helena, and she is the Helena was the real mother of Mary Magdalene, but she adopted these 2 twins And these two twins were James and John. So there you got James and John.
Yeah, and
and
they're
they
the
were
adopted brothers of Mary Magdalene.
right.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
Which is why she would know them and then get to know Jesus.
Yes, that's right. And it also was a powerful thing for them to have descendants of Caesar in your group, right? Two of your disciples are descendants of Jesus. So of Caesar was a powerful thing that you could talk about. So, all right, James and John. Let's see what we got next. Philip is kind of unknown too. We have a whole gospel from him, so he had important connections. Thomas is a really fun one because Thomas is called Didymus, meaning the twin. Well, why is he called the twin? Because his mother was one of the wives of Herod the Great, and she was supposedly involved in a plot to have Herod poisoned. And when he discovered the plot, of course, he tortured people to death, and they might say things that weren't really true, but because she was implicated in this poison plot, her son, who was supposed to be the next Herod, was dethroned and not allowed to be. He lost his inheritance. So he was a disinherited Herod. And that's who Thomas was. So again, he had a lot of status as one of the
some
disciples.
important people
right?
here.
Yes, right. All right, so let's see, Thomas, and then we've got two other,
Is it Thaddeus?
Okay, Thaddeus, that's a good one. All right.
I always like him.
Thaddeus is also Thaddeus, and he is also Barabbas. He was one of the people at the beginning that Judas, the Judas who rebelled against the taxation at the time that Jesus was young, really young. He was involved in fighting against the taxation. So he was a very popular hero. And that's why they said, we'll take Jesus over Barabbas, because he was already well known and loved by the people, because he was quite old. And the other thing was that he wouldn't have survived the crucifixion because he was old. But that's who he is. So he's an important guy also.
Yeah.
Let's see. So, and all right. So now Judas Iscariot took over from the other Judas who was killed during that rebellion that Thaddeus survived. Judas was killed, but then Judas Iscariot had taken over his leadership as one of the fighters against the Romans. They had a name which is escaping me now. They had, and Iscariot, of course, was a symbol for that knife that they used to kill people. Just walk down the street and stab somebody and walk away, and nobody would know they did it. So he was Judas. So he was one of the rebels. Okay. Then we've got who have we got left here? Simon. There is Simon Magus. It's Simon Magus. He's called Simon the Zealot, Simon the Canaanite, but his real name is Simon Magus. He's one of the disciples of Jesus. They weren't actually disciples in that sense, because it was just the group were the people. They weren't studying under Jesus per se. They were the 12 people who were the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was the superior of Jesus at that point. So I don't know if we've left out anybody. This is terrible, right?
I didn't realize that these apostles.
Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Simon Magus, Thaddeus,
Judas.
Oh, okay, I've got one of them is Matthew. Matthew is one of them. He was actually Matthias, and he was the son of the high priest, and I can't think of his name.
But this is the Jewish high priest, obviously.
Yeah, he was the Jewish high priest, and he had 6 or 7 sons, and all of them became priests sooner or later. And he actually became a priest later. This Matthias person, he became priest, and he's the one that got the books published that the Revelations is talking about. He wrote the book of Matthew. He's Matthew, and he was a high priest, and he was a high priest for a few years. And then his younger brother, was a high priest at the time. You'll see the dedication is the next high priest in one of the books. Was the next high priest after Matthias. But Matthias was the one that put it into motion. He wanted the whole world to have the story of Jesus out there in the public. So he wrote the book of Matthew. And so I don't know if that's all of it. I guess.
But you were saying earlier about these books that were being written, the 4 Gospels of the horses, the riders of the apocalypse, or what are said to be the riders of the apocalypse, because they're bringing forth the story of Jesus and the spiritual teachings of Jesus, but more like a history. And then you were saying that earlier we were discussing about how there's actually 7 books, though. So there's the 4 Gospels, Revelations. Right. Could we perhaps talk about that?
Right. Yeah. So there were 7 seals, and each seal was a book also. So that you've got the 4 there, but then the 5th book would be like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Thomas, and then you've got Revelations would be the 7th book. So those were the 7 seals there. Yes. So of course they reject the Nicene people rejected so many things. Now they rejected those 2 wonderful Gospels that we have now from the Nag Hammadi, which is intriguing because they came about in this kind of Renaissance that brought us Gurdjieff and Uspensky and the Nag Hammadi scrolls. It's just an amazing time. Okay, well, going back to those books, those 4 books of the Bible, I told you the one by Matthew is written by Matthias, but then there's Mark was written by Peter. That was written by Peter, and Mark was the scribe. And there's this whole secret book of Mark, which is very intriguing because that gives you the answer to the raising of Lazarus. Because the secret Gospel of Mark says that somebody talked from the grave, meaning that that Lazarus was still alive. He wasn't dead. He was dead in the metaphorical sense. He was dead because he was the one who was like the second to the high priest, and that was Simon Magus. And he had been excommunicated. That was his death. And Jesus went there and raised him from the dead, which put him in jeopardy. Because he said, I have the power to do that, and I'm going to raise you from the dead. It was symbolic in the sense that he actually was put in a tomb, but he would have lived there for quite a while. So that's another miracle.
So it's like Jesus trod on the toes of the people that were supposed to be doing, the leaders of the groups, but instead he's taken over their roles and doing them because they're not doing it.
And you'll notice that he took quite a while to decide to do it. It was a scary thing to do because he knew it was like signing his death warrant to do it. He didn't go right away. They said, well, why? He's been dead. Lazarus has been dead for like 3 days and you didn't even come and you could have saved him, you know? It's like, well, first of all, he knew that he was still alive. And second of all, he was afraid to do it.
Do you think it meant something like that Lazarus went into a bit of perhaps a dark pit, that maybe he was losing his faith or something? Does it mean something like that, and that's why he had to be reborn? Or is it just a role, like he was going up in his roles?
No, he was the head of the church
He
to
was
on
the
the
head.
outside. Yeah,
Oh,
he would have to be under the high priest, obviously, but the high priest again was an elected position. So you're not in this. Well, anyway, let's see. So anyway, I was talking about the books of the Bible. So then Luke is interesting because Luke was the same as Cornelius, who was the centurion who said to Jesus, "You don't need to come and heal my son. He just say the word, and I know he'll be healed." And that was Luke, and he became a total friend and follower of Jesus at that point, and he wrote the book of Luke. And then we've got the book of John, which is actually written by Jesus and scribed by John. But that John, see, I may have made a mistake on that one. That's the missing John, Bartholomew. Okay.
Bartholomew.
John, there's James and John, but
Mm-hmm.
John didn't write John. It's John Mark, who is the same as Bartholomew. He wrote, and he was the one that was on Jesus's shoulder at the Last Supper. That's John Mark, and the trouble is he's left out. He's not talked about enough to know. Well, the trouble with the Gospel of John anyway is that they don't list the 12 disciples, that you have to find them in the different stories. Just track all the names that are eventually mentioned, and you'll find them all there.
Oh, okay. I
But
never noticed that.
they're not done as a list of 12.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So that's John Mark, and that's very important. That's a different John, and that John is another interesting person because he was the servant of Agrippa. Because there's another source to the Pesher of Christ, and that's Josephus was a historian. He was one of the Jewish rebels, and when they were about to be captive, they decided that they all should be killed, and then each one would kill another, and they played this. He was smart enough to do this game where he'd wind up the last person, so he was alive and everybody else was dead. And
well,
then
like Russian roulette.
Yeah, it was like that. And then he joined. He put up a flag of truce and became a good friend of the emperor of Rome. And he got to be in Rome, and he wrote the story of the Jews. It goes from the beginning of time through it. But he doesn't mention much about Jesus, and they don't know if the passage was added about Jesus's crucifixion or not. But a lot of other information there is very, very important that he wrote. And he talks about this servant who, it was, let me see, it was Caligula. Yeah, Caligula. No, Caligula was the friend. I don't know, he caught Agrippa saying something bad about the emperor and reported it. And he got Agrippa thrown in jail for a long period of time, a few years or so. But the funny thing is that he was then accused of stealing this coat, stealing a coat. It's a funny thing to think about that this person who turned him in was then accused of stealing a coat. But it turned out that this coat really was what Jesus had worn at the crucifixion. So it wasn't just any old coat. So I'm doing that. That's kind of an aside, but it shows you in Josephus, there's a lot of information like that about the different characters in Jesus's life, and it's a wonderful source to decode everything.
So all these books, even though they're like biographies, aren't they? But they're also putting across the spiritual teaching that Jesus was giving everybody at the same time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting format to follow through to the end of the crucifixion, and then, well, then they tacked on some things at the end. Actually, one of the things they tacked on at the end of one of the books was the Gospel of John. Well, anyway, it's the one where they're down at the sea and they're fishing and they're cooking some fish, and then Jesus appears before them after the crucifixion. And that was one that everyone agrees was added on later. But that's the wonderful one that where Jesus is asking Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Of course I love you." And he says it 3 times. But Jesus is using the word for agape love, and Peter's using the word for phileo love, and he just doesn't get it. But that, to me, is the most interesting one, because that to me is what the whole Christian church was about in that time. The agape love that you're not trying to get personal gain from it. It's love for people.
Unconditional
and
love.
People were willing to die for that feeling, that I love this person, and if you're going to kill me for it, then go ahead and kill me. It's like, that was such an important force. It is a very powerful concept. And so that's what I'd want people to be left with about what Jesus taught, because that was different. That was different than the Jewish religion, where you had a God that was going to punish you for all these things you did. And yet this was something that you yourself would do. It came from yourself to love another.
So he was a teacher of love.
Yes, yeah. And I don't know, there are so many other miracles that I could go into. I don't know if you have a miracle that bothered you.
Well, for me, it was more, I think it's more of like trying to explain to people that the miracles are not literal. They've got a meaning behind them, which is a spiritual meaning, and really is about people's spiritual development, aren't they?
Right. But people don't think that.
No. They
the biggest thing is,
literally.
Of course, in the Da Vinci Code, at the very end, she tries to walk on water, and she says, "Oh, well, I guess I'm not that good yet, but I'll work on it."
But that's not what he meant.
The walking on water thing is so absurd, because have I talked about the different towns on the Dead Sea?
No, let's talk about them then, because they are quite important, aren't they?
Right, because
you covered it briefly.
Yeah. So Qumran is the Jerusalem of the Essenes, and
that's
in the Bible it's coded as being plural.
Right.
So whenever you see Jerusalem plural, it's really talking about Qumran. And then below Qumran, there's Ein Feshka, and there's Mazin further down. And Mazin was the area where they did the baptisms. And the story about him walking on water was because that they had a jetty out there. The boat would be there, and Peter would be there to lower the people into the salt water as part of their baptism as Gentiles. And he would be there, and then the priest would come and he would bless them. And then they could then be semi-part of the church as Gentiles. And of course, one time early in the morning, they saw Jesus walking out in the fog, and it looked like he was walking on water, and blah, 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 he walked on water. That's all it was.
Right, so it was just because of the fog.
And the other image, what? I should let you go. What are you
No,
going
I
to
was going to
say?
say that if that's just like so it's the weather giving an illusion.
Right, right. Because it's also backed up by Jesus then being in a storm and then calming the storm, and then Peter wanting to walk on water. And because there's that story too. But that storm was the problems that were going on against the church at that time. That was the storm that was happening. They used that allusion too again with Paul, that he was in a storm, a shipwreck on the way to Rome. The storm is always an image of something other than a real storm. And of course, the concept of Peter wanting to walk on the water like Jesus did is an image, of course, that he was afraid to take over from Jesus after Jesus gave him the leadership. So
Big
that
gap to fill, yes, or to follow
yeah,
him.
so he would, he tried to do it, he fell in because he just didn't have. It's a tough role to fill.
I did want to ask you actually. Can we talk about Judas Iscariot in this?
Oh yes, I had promised that in the last talk. Well, okay. You can see that there are different versions of the story. There is an Eastern version of the stories, which is more in the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of in the whole Nag Hammadi text shows you there's a whole different version, that the East and the West were not exactly the same on the same page. And in fact, the whole Islam came from the Eastern view of Christianity. So Islam says that Jesus didn't die on the cross because they're using that text. But, and you can see that Gurdjieff got that text because he was from the East. And in that text, you might be able to assume that there's the Gospel of Judas, actually, that came to light recently. See, Gospel of Judas was saying exactly what Gurdjieff said, that Judas was doing the right thing. He was preventing them from being disrupted and cushioning them from being taken too soon. That's really what it's kind of saying in that. He wasn't an enemy of Jesus. He was actually his best friend, So that's where Gurdjieff got that from. But if you look in detail in the Gospels, on the surface, it shows that he's a traitor. I mean, he left early, and which was strange, in the middle of the ceremony. And the next thing, of course, is that Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane and he was captured there. It seems like he's obviously the culprit. But the most intriguing thing is that when you start figuring out who's on the cross, if you look about who was made to carry the cross, it was they talk about, I guess that's not relevant. There's a person called Alexander, and there's a person called that's too much of a tangent to go off on. I'd have to see the text.
That's okay.
But anyway, there's one of the robbers on the cross is saying to Jesus, if you're so good, why don't you just get us off the cross right now, if you have these powers, right? And that was Judas, because Judas was always doubting the ability of Jesus to be able to do all these things, because he felt that that weapons were the way to do it. Rebellion was the way to do it. He was never totally on the side of agape love, for sure. But so the interesting thing is that on the cross you've got Jesus, but you also have Simon Magus on the cross, who was another enemy of Caiaphas, just called a robber, but he's on the cross, and Judas is on the cross. And you could tell which robber was the Judas one because of what he said. The other one said, I'll meet you in heaven. See, so that's Simon Magus and Jesus, who did love each other very much. And although they had their differences, they were all on the cross. So when Jesus was given the supposed poison that made him look as if he was dead, they took them down early. And I don't think we've talked about that here, is the fact that all the things that all three of them succeeded in surviving the cross because it looked like Jesus had died. But there was a time change in the Jewish area. They had two different time systems and they were going to join them together. And there was three hours apart, because if you start looking at the different gospels and time them, you'll see one gospel is ahead of the other by 3 hours. And that's the 3-hour time change. And the 3-hour time change happened while they were on the cross. So they were on the cross 3 hours later, 3 hours less than they might have been. So they went up on the cross, I think, around 9 o'clock, and they were taken down, I think, around
It was in the
3 or 4
afternoon,
o'clock,
wasn't it?
something like that. But if you subtract 3 hours from that, they weren't on the cross very long at all.
No, 3
So
hours.
they tricked Pilate in this. And so Jesus got taken down, and so did Judas and Simon Magus. And then when the women go to the caves where they were, they had, you'll notice that they talk about, you have to be clear about how many angels they saw.
I thought it was 2.
2 angels, yeah, okay, yeah, you're right.
I hope I'm right.
Thank you. 2 angels, right. But one of them spoke to Mary Magdalene and said, it's okay, he's alive. And the other one was just kind of crunched over in the back of the cave. And that was Judas. The other one, Simon Magus, was the one that said to Mary Magdalene that Jesus is still alive. And of course, she didn't know exactly, the wording of that was such that Mary didn't know that Jesus was right behind her at that point. She turned around and saw him. But okay, so Judas was still alive in the cave, but they pretty much ignored him. And then Simon Magus, Jesus was rescued from the cave, and that's talked about in the Gospel of Peter. It's a wonderful saying. It talks about, it says that the soldiers were camped outside and they saw 2 men go down and 3 men come up. Now, in one of the Gospels, it talks about John, who's John Mark, and Peter. Peter and John Mark were woken up by Mary Magdalene, who said that Jesus has gone from the cave, because she thought that Jesus wasn't in the cave, and she ran back to them and she said, wake up, they've stolen his body. So they come running up, and then they go down into the cave and they find Jesus, and Jesus is standing. He's revived, and they take him out of the cave. He's sort of on their shoulders, the 2 of them side by side. And this is what the Gospel of Peter is talking about. The 3 men come up, and then he goes down the hill, and behind him is the cross or something like that. It's so poetic the way it's worded. It's talking about the rescue. Right at that point, they came and got Jesus and brought him down the hill. That's John Mark and Peter did that. And then you have Acts. Then in Acts, Peter is giving a talk, and he talks about the field of blood and the fact that Judas was hurled down into this field, and it became the field of blood. And what they did then was to throw him over the hill because he was a traitor.
They didn't forgive him then.
No, they didn't forgive him, no. That's the difference of personality between Simon Magus and Jesus. Simon Magus told Thaddeus, who's really strong, throw him over the side. That's it. We're done with him. So that really is the true story. of Judas.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Dylan. It's been a fascinating hour. I'm really,
But it's amazing because I read it so many times about the women at the cave and all that, and I never once remembered Peter and John running to the cave. I never remembered that part. And then suddenly I saw it there and I said, wow, that's amazing thing. The thing was that Mary Magdalene was pregnant at the time that Jesus was on the cross. And that John is, and Jesus is telling John Mark, take care of the baby. He's talking to the baby. If you see his wording, you'll see that it's more of the baby he's talking about.
Yeah, his future child,
which
right.
proves that she was pregnant at the time. And because she was pregnant, she was allowed to walk around at night, whereas everybody, it was a holy day, and nobody was allowed out after sundown. That was another thing in their favor, that they had to take them off the cross before the sun went down, because that was a violation of Jewish law. So the Romans had to respect that too. So that's the reason they brought the other two down, even though they hadn't actually expired the way Jesus did. So she was allowed to wander about because she was pregnant, because obviously she'd have to take care of herself. And so she got them to come up and get Jesus out of the tomb. So remember, we set up this share screen. I'd like to go through all the people, because I think it's amazing to see how everyone's related.
Okay, so should we do that now?
Yeah. There, do you see it?
Right. Yes, we do now. We've got it.
Yeah. Okay.
So do you want to?
So here, if you follow through, if we go find Jesus here, we've got Heli, who's the same as Joseph, depending on which genealogy you look at. And his son is Joseph. And he has James as his son. And well, what did I say? He has Jesus. Joseph has Jesus and James. And James is actually the oldest, so I wasn't. See, Jesus is the youngest. Okay, Jesus was born in 7 BC, and James was born in 1 AD. Okay, the point about James is that Jesus was conceived while
before they were married.
Before they were married, right? But James was born correctly, so he started the new millennium on his birth. That's 1 AD is when he was born. So there's Jesus, there's James, there's Joses, who's Barnabas, who went with Paul. You have Jude, who is also talked about in Acts, and you have what's his name? I can't read it from here. Simon.
Simon, yeah.
Simon. Yeah, so these were these are talked about as sons of Jesus, of Mary. Were all the sons. These were the sons.
Okay. Then you have
so
Jesus.
You've got Jesus thinks that.
Jesus marries
is
Mary.
Married to Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is connected to Simon Magus here. He adopted. Let's see. He adopted Helena, who was the mother of Phoebe. Let's see. I'm getting confused here. All right. So Simon Magus is Lazarus and B666, and he was married to Helena, who's also Joanna or Saint Salome or Saint Martha. That was the Martha in the story, Mary and Martha. So, but Mary is Simon Magus was the stepfather, and Helena was the mother of Mary Magdalene. And then Mary Magdalene married Jesus, and she had a daughter. She was pregnant at the time of the crucifixion, and she had a daughter called Phoebe, or Damaris. And then the most amazing thing is that Phoebe marries Paul.
Oh, wow. I've not heard that one before. Okay.
And Paul, now, people didn't know this, but Paul was related to Herod Antipas, who was the son of Herod the Great. And that it slips up because they actually reveal that when Paul is imprisoned. And they mention one of the sons who is Herod. And Paul, you can track it back to showing that St. Paul is related to Herod.
Because Paul was Saul before, wasn't he?
Right. Yeah, he just took on that name so he could be more Christian than the Herod family.
Well, also sometimes when people have a spiritual awakening or change their religion or their faith, they do take on a new name, don't they?
Right.
To go with their new way of life.
Right. Yeah, that really was his conversion time. He was blinded, and again, that allegory of being blinded. Okay, so Mary Magdalene and Jesus then had another son who's Jesus Justus. And the way you figure these out is that the Essene rule was that you had to wait 3 years for every child if you were married, because marriage wasn't encouraged. But if you were one of the elites, you got to marry. And so the fact that Mary Magdalene had a daughter meant that in 3 years she could have another child, and that child is Jesus Justus, and he is in the Bible, in the New Testament. And then there was another son, and
that's Joseph, named it after his father.
Yeah, they named him Joseph. It's not specifically said, but
where's
I'm assuming.
Where's Jesus Justus mentioned in the Bible? I do know that name.
Yes, he's mentioned in Acts as one of the apostles of Paul.
Okay.
Or just one of the apostles equal to Paul. All right, so then Jesus actually got married again to Lydia because Mary Magdalene divorced him.
What?
She felt that she had done her duty having 3 children to him. And she basically went into seclusion and was watched over by John Mark. The way, let's see, how do you know that she was divorced?
The answer to be on your website.
Right. Yeah, I gotta go to my website or read my book. Yep. But the fact that Jesus married again is really weird. And then he had a son, because you can see that based on the time frame.
He's the son of Lydia.
Okay, so the interesting thing is, of course, that James was a rival, really, of Jesus, because he was considered he was born according to the rules. And he got in a lot of trouble later on in Acts. You'll see he was killed. He was killed by one of the high priests, the youngest one of the 7, I guess, of the high priests, because there was Matthias, and then there was Ananias, or whatever his name is. He got James killed because James was causing a lot of problems. And then Joses is quite interesting. He's Barnabas, and he's one of the people that went around with Paul. And it's again the Clementines that revealed who he was. It said that Joses is Barnabas in the Clementines. And then there's Jude, who is mentioned one time. Actually, these sons are mentioned quite all together. Simon, Jude, and Joses are mentioned all together, the three of them, in one of the sections in the Apostles. So anyway, I find that really intriguing to see how everyone's related here in the family.
I didn't realize so many of his disciples were part of the elite or from elite families. That is interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's another thing to run through those ones. So I can stop the share, right? There we go, and I'm back again. All right.
Hey. Well, thank you very much for that. It's been a very interesting show. Definitely made, because I've been looking at your website on and off for the last year and finding things to read and look at. So
as I said, there's so much material out there and so many things you have to set and prove that it's really hard to do it.
Your website is huge, and I do, if people are interested in this, go to this. And your books are available through the website, aren't they? And there can be ebooks.
Well, they're on Amazon. I have two books actually. There's the Pesher of Christ, and the other one is, which I was proud of. That was one, Paulina's Promise to a Grandfather Jesus.
What was that one called? Sorry.
The relationship of Paulina being the daughter of Paul.
Oh.
And so that's why its title came about. I was really proud of that one. And well, the other thing, I don't know what I was going to say.
Well, we spoke for over an hour, so I think we should leave it at that.
Yeah.
That's a lot to take in, and I really ask people to go to your website, and we can always do another show and do other talks about this kind of thing, because I love it. I could talk about this kind of thing forever. So I want to thank you very much.
Yeah, it was fun. Wonderful.
Do you want to just say what your website is, the address?
PesherofChrist.com.
Thank you very much, Dylan. Much appreciated.
Okay, well, thank you. This was fun.
We'll do it again soon.
All right. Bye.
Bye.